Then the Bucks send a message while Dame hits a franchise milestone. We ask who should be executive of the year, and is anybody really good in the NBA? This is Locked On NBA.
You are Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On NBA, your daily source for all things NBA from the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making this your first listen. We appreciate you guys being a part of our community. My name's Matt Moore. I'm the senior NBA writer for the Action Network, co-host of Locked On Nuggets. His name is Tony East. He's host of Locked On Pacers, covers all things Pacers, all things Indiana. If there's an Indiana sports team, Tony is probably covering it at some point. You can find him on Twitter at TEastNBA. Tony, how you doing?
I'm good. I think we're past the point where plugging Twitter handles is the move. I think that is going to be a long lost art of podcast intro that is now no longer part of what we do.
You can find me on Instagram at. You can find me on what's the new one? I forget.
I don't know.
Don't know. On today's show, we're going to talk about Giannis and Dame because both of those guys had signature nights. One of them in a win, one of them in a loss. We're going to talk about guys that finish with one franchise and the importance of that. We're going to talk about executive of the year and who should win that, including a kind of a reframing of how maybe we should look at this award. And in the final segment, we're going to ask the question of NBA parity and trying to just determine what it really means right now, as it's hard to figure out which teams are going and which teams are on their way up and down, and if teams are really great or if everybody is just kind of or if maybe a lot of teams are both at the same time. It's a confusing time in the NBA, which makes it very interesting. But we'll start in New Orleans as the Milwaukee Bucks, fresh off getting their absolute pants thrown down by the Memphis Grizzlies over the weekend, showed up and had a very competitive, very interesting game versus the New Orleans Pelicans. Pelicans, obviously, a surprise contender in the Western Conference this season. Everyone kind of thought they'd be better. No one really thought they'd be this good. They have been at the top of the Western Conference standings. They were number one there for a short little stint. And the first half of that game was really interesting and really competitive. The Bucks really honed in on Zion Williamson and put a concerted effort to try and not just make things tough for him, but to outright shut him down and not allow him to even get shots up. He only took 16 shots compared to 24 for CJ McCollum and 24 for Jonas Valanciunas. The Bucks did a really good job of crowding him, being physical with him. They brought help off of Herb Jones, notably, especially late in the game. Pels made a couple of runs in this one, but Tony, this was like a very strong performance by Giannis Antetokounmpo, who finished with the usual Giannis stuff: 42 points, 10 rebounds, 1 assists, 1 block, 12 of 17 from the floor, 1 of 3 from 3-point range. They also, though, they got 30 points from Brook Lopez, who was really great. He was in a battle with Jonas Valanciunas, who had 37, including 28 with like 4 minutes left in the second quarter. This was a higher scoring game maybe than I was expecting, but it was another game where the Bucks, the Grizzlies game may have been just as impressive for Memphis, because usually in these games, Milwaukee's like overall record has not been, their record is great. They're at the top of the Eastern Conference, but their statistical record isn't awesome. But they have these games where the Bucks are just like, just so everybody knows, you're going to have to go through us. Like, just so everybody in the league knows we are the baddest men in town. And this was another one of those nights, I felt like.
Yeah, after getting steamrolled, embarrassed, I mean, there's no better word for it, by the Grizz, the Bucks have now come out and said, okay, that is not us, right? They beat the Jazz with Conley, which is an important distinction, because the with Conley Jazz are very good, while the without Conley Jazz are very meh. And then they stomp a contender in New Orleans tonight, which is a huge win over, like you said, a surprising contender in that team, especially when they get a night where Valanciunas looks like the best player on the court for the most of the first half and is hitting a bunch of threes, and Point Zion is emerging, and CJ McCollum, who's had a down year, has an up night, and they still can handle that. I think that's very impressive. And looking at the two guys you mentioned specifically, the standout thing to me, right? If you get 30 from Brook Lopez, that's usually good. But the Bucks in this game, between Giannis and Brook Lopez going 12 for 17, shot 78% on 2-pointers. 32 out of their 41 2-point shots went in. So the Pelicans, that's where they fell apart in this game. They were not defending on the inside enough. They were not providing enough resistance around the basket, and that's hard against the Bucks. Their thing they did for a long time when they were building this team was length, arms everywhere, right? And it was like kind of a joke for a while. But now that all these players are actualized and connected, they have all this length that makes it so easy for them to do really well when they're on a roll getting near the basket. In this game, that reared its head.
Yeah, I know Chris Middleton tonight, even as he set out to get a little bit more rest as he recovers from the injury. I think one of the things that is notable here too is there's always this question when a team makes a run in the regular season of like, I think they could win the Western. Like, the playoffs are a different animal, and tonight was a pretty good example. And like, look, you can definitely point to the games versus the Suns; those were playoff atmospheres, and the Pelicans have absolutely just like they trucked them in those first two games in New Orleans. Lost the one closer in Phoenix. That's definitely going to be a battle, but it just kind of show you the teams that can bring the kind of physicality that Milwaukee brings. Those are when New Orleans is faced with teams that are tougher than them, and there's not a lot. It might be an issue. It's interesting to see Giannis kind of, once again having another monster night on the same night that Damian Lillard sets the all-time Blazers franchise record for points. He passes Clyde Drexler in a sadly losing effort to the Oklahoma City Thunder, who get Shai Gilgeous-Alexander back. We'll talk about how that's kind of how this league is now in the third segment. But you look at Dame and you look at Giannis, and these are two of the guys that have bucked the trend of the superstar actions. They are not guys that have chosen to go pursue the nightlife, the beaches, the taking their talents to South Beach, teaming up with their buddies. They have chosen to do it in the cities that they were drafted to, and cities that really have embraced each of them. And they continue to be very successful. And for Damian Lillard, like Dame's going to go down as one of, if not probably the greatest Blazer of all time. And whether or not he wins the title, Giannis obviously has won a title. So the Bucks history is a little bit deeper with Lou Alcindor, et cetera. But there's a lot of opportunities here, I think, for Giannis to make his own name. And in some ways, those are things that even if it's just to the communities, do matter to them as much as winning a title.
100%. It was almost a super sweet storybook night for Dame, too, because he only needed 21 for the record. He got 28, but his 28th points tied it up on a reverse layup very late in the game, like 4 seconds left, just for Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who, I mean, my God, that guy. We'll be talking about him in the third segment for sure, because what the heck, the Thunder are good because he's awesome. Hits a game winner at the end, but Dame breaks the record and deserves a ton of praise for, sticking with a franchise like this. And it's weird the way, I don't want to say it's weird, I guess. It's talked about strangely. Like, the Blazers made a conference finals, right? Like, they had a team good enough to do it. It's not like he was sticking around and it was like a silly choice. They were good. Obviously, I don't think anyone ever thought they were title contender good. But he stuck around with a good team, and I think it's noble to stick with one franchise, especially one like Portland. And Sam Esfandiari talks about this a lot. He covers the Golden State Warriors, but part of the reason the Warriors are so popular locally, beyond that they're one of the best teams ever, is like they drafted every single guy in their core that's been a part of the dynasty. They drafted Draymond, they drafted Clay, they drafted Steph. They have that attachment with the fans. Same with Dame in Portland, where you draft that guy and he grows with your franchise into a superstar. He gets you to the conference finals, and now he's your franchise leader in points. Like, that's a name in the rafters, dude. That's a jersey that'll be at every game for 30 years. I mean, that's just special for a franchise and a player, and I think it's really cool that Dame did that. And obviously, Giannis is a different echelon where his jersey will be worn at every arena for the next 30 years. But it's fitting they played on the same night and both played very well.
Let's take a break. We'll come back and we'll talk about Executive of the Year, our thoughts on that award, who might be leading in that category, as well as look around at like how that award is decided and maybe what we want to see change. We'll definitely come back on Locked On NBA, but first I need to tell you about Taro. Taro is the world's largest car sharing marketplace. With Taro, you can book any car you want, wherever you want it, from a community of local hosts. You can browse a huge selection of vehicles for just about any occasion or budget across the US, the UK, Canada, and Australia. You can book a spacious SUV or a minivan for a family road trip. If I get a car, I've got the kids with me, I have to get something with some back room so that they're not constantly fighting with each other and distracting me with the roughhousing. No roughhousing in the car, says Dad. Get a classic or luxury car for a special event, birthday, or a holiday. You can find affordable economy cars if you just want to get from A to B, or you can test drive that new electric vehicle that you've had your eye on to see how it fits your everyday life. Many Turo hosts can even deliver the car right to you. Every trip is backed by liability insurance. Terms, conditions, and exclusions apply. Forget boring rental cars and find your drive at Turo.com. We'll be right back on Locked On NBA. Back here on Locked On NBA. Thanks for joining us, making us part of your day. Appreciate you guys being with us. Matt Moore alongside Tony East, getting you set for your Tuesday. If you want to catch up on all the action from the games in the association on Monday night, make sure to check out Game to Game right here on this podcast feed. So, Tony, we're going to talk about Executive of the Year because this has been rattling around in my head the last couple of days thinking about it. At the start of the year last year, the Pelicans were really underperforming. And they were honestly head nowhere. Their big signing was like Devontae Graham, and Zion was nowhere to be seen. And like there was questions about Zion even sticking around. There was like, is he going to sign the qualifying offer? They pull off this trade at the deadline, as well as they get a little bit better as the year goes on. They find some guys. And now you look at the complete body of work for David Griffin. And it's interesting because the idea is like executive of the year, so to speak. But your work building each year's team does start, I think, the year before. And so if you look at it, they draft Herb Jones. This season, they draft Dyson Daniels, who's been great for them. Last year, they drafted Trey Murphy, who's been terrific, even better than Herb, honestly, this season, who's having a little bit of a rough stretch. They find Jose Alvarado, who's been such a revelation for their bench. They trade not only for CJ McCollum, but also for Larry Nance, who's such a big part of that second unit. They deal out Steven Adams, and they bring in Jonas Valanciunas, who's a much better fit for what they wanted to accomplish both with and without Zion Williamson. They get Zion back into the fold. They get him re-engaged where he's on an MVP track. They're one of the deepest teams in the league. So my question for you is, we were talking before the show and you're kind of like, sometimes they give this award to guys that have done the work like years and years prior. The work of an executive is kind of like a culmination of moves. Would David Griffin qualify for you as executive of the year, or do you think he did most of the work last year?
Yeah, it's tricky, right? Like if I feel like a lot of times this award is given to either a guy who like all the fruits of his past labor paid off. That happened last year with Kleiman in Memphis. That's not the only thing that Memphis did well last year. Like they are very good at drafting every single year. They make timely trades. They did it again this offseason. But like even before that, James Jones trades for Chris Paul, wins Executive of the Year. The Clippers get Kawhi and PG. Like that guy's going to win Executive of the Year. A lot of times it's that big thing. But this year that big trade hasn't really happened yet, or at least one that I think like, yeah, that will win you Exec of the Year. And so Griffin does fit that bill of like did all the stuff last year. Like the Daniels pick looks good. A lot of their more minor stuff has really been paying off this season. But like, if it's the year 2022, he would be the winner. But the fact that the award is what it is means it's hard for me to say season he's done any more or less than anyone else because they just got everybody back and healthy. And it's kind of like all the people they've added over time are together. But that said, history does say that has happened and had a winner have that be the case before, if that makes sense.
It does. I got two more names I kind of want to bounce off of you for consideration. And these ones are maybe more in the line of like stuff that happened this year. First, I'll give you the easy one and then my really bizarro galaxy brain take one in a second. Get excited for this one. But first, I want to tell you, how about Monty McNair? There's reports from Hall of Famer Mark Stein that McNair in Sacramento is probably going to be extended. Look, I'm of the opinion that if you get the Kings to the playoffs, Mike Brown deserves Coach of the Year. And I'm of the opinion that if you get the Kings to the playoffs, the Monty McNair deserves Executive of the Year, especially without like a marquee superstar to just like drag you there, right? He does the Tyrese Halliburton trade, and sure, I understand all the long-term implications of that deal. And I did a deep dive on Tyrese last week for Action, and holy crap, is he amazing. And the second coming of Steve Nash, it's incredible to watch him. But it's not just, you can't look at that move in a vacuum, right? It's not just the trade of Hallie for Domantas. It's what they've done elsewise. It's drafting Keegan Murray. It's developing Davion Mitchell. It's bringing in Kevin Huerter, who has been such a huge part of their team. They have made all of the little moves to put them in this position to where the Kings, although they did lose to the Hornets tonight, and again, we'll talk about how often that's happening lately in a minute, but even after all that, they're still 16-13, which is a really great spot for the Kings to be in. Currently, as we sit here, 29 games into the season, a third of the way through, the Sacramento Kings are the 6th seed. They wouldn't even be in the play-in right now. They probably will be by the end of the season, but right now they wouldn't even be in the play-in. What about Monty McNair's chances for Executive of the Year?
He's done a lot of good stuff that was also this season, right? Like this. Yeah. Sometimes, like, does the draft count as this season?
This season, technically, yeah. Yes.
So, like, Keegan Murray's in their rotation. He drafted him. He hired a new coach. Like, that is also a thing that Executive of the Years do. You nailed the big one. Kevin Huerter has been great for them, not only because they didn't have enough shooting, but because he's a dynamite fit with what Sabonis is really good at, with pitches and handoffs and screening for guards. And you missed the big one. Mike Brown's been championing this guy for 6th man of the year all season, Matt Moore. Malik Monk. Great signing for them. Killer for them off the bench, right? That is like a lot of the Executive of the Year check boxes, right? He got a lot of big stuff this year. He made a big trade. Yeah, it was last season, but it was recently, right? It's all culminating in a big year for the franchise. He's done a lot of the stuff that would make him, a very much leading candidate, I think, if voting was right now. And I think I know who your last guy is going to be, but I'll let you throw it out.
Okay. I honestly think maybe the coach of the year or the executive of the year should be Sean Marks of the Brooklyn Nets.
Oh, that's not what I thought you were going to say, but yes.
So think of it this way. Look, what's a harder thing than finding a team to have success when your franchise player demands a trade in part over to try and get you fired and you manage to survive it? Like, look at where the Nets are, in part because of what Marks has done. He stares down all the situations. He doesn't commit the long-term money to Kyrie Irving because of his instability and all of those kinds of issues that have come along. He adds TJ Warren. He adds Markieff Morris, who's been good for them. He's drafted some of the guys that have contributed, especially like in that game win versus the Pacers. Cam Thomas, Day'Ron Sharpe, those guys both contributed. He was part of that. He has navigated these waters. He has gotten through all this. That to me is like one of the toughest jobs of a GM is to manage the egos and to try and get through it. He fired Steve Nash. Okay. They fired Steve Nash, but still Jacques Vaughn was on the roster in part because Katie wanted him, but still, I just think it would be very hilarious if Sean Marks got executive of the year essentially for surviving Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. I love the idea of that story.
Does not trading Katie count as a move made by an executive? Yeah. Well, but then it's like, do we give the Bucks credit for not trading Giannis? Obviously, I know the difference. I'm just messing around, but like, yeah, he's done a good job in their circumstance. And 2 years ago they had better role players and they traded a lot of them for Harden, and they had none in the playoffs last year. But like to get Sumner, Warren, and Royce O'Neal, like all these little moves in. Like those are big deals for a team that did not have the depth to survive last year around their stars. Now they have it. Simmons is playing at some varying level of whatever word you want to use to describe how Ben Simmons is playing. Like, yeah, they're 4th in the East now. Like they're a good team, and given where they were even a month ago, yeah, he deserves a lot of credit, even for the timing of the Nats hire. They did it after a win, right? They beat the Pacers 2 days later. He's out. Like that takes some stones and some swinging your power on kind of stuff. So yes, I think that would be a very fitting choice. I thought you were going to say the guy who fits the very much traditional box of what wins executive of the year, and that would be Kobe Altman, right? If the Cavs get 3rd in the East, or they get 50-something wins, oh, you traded for Donovan Mitchell. Like that is usually what this has been, right? And that's fine. Like he acquired the pieces to do it and did it. So that's why I feel like he's going to be and look, the Cavs are good. He deserves a lot of credit for that. But that is like what it has been a lot of the time in the past.
Let's take a break. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about how it is that the Thunder beat the Blazers and the Spurs beat the Rockets. That's not necessarily all that surprising. We'll talk about the Timberwolves beating the Mavericks. We'll talk about all of this stuff and the Hornets beating the Kings. through the prism of one word, parity, and how it really is defining this NBA season. We'll do that when we come back on Locked On NBA. But first, I need to tell you about BetOnline. BetOnline is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from pro football to college bowl season to basketball. We've got it all at betonline.net. If you love sports podcasts, you can even find those at BetOnline as well. We're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. We'll be right back on Locked On NBA. Back here on Locked On NBA, thanks for joining us, making us part of your day, making us your first listen. Make your second listen Locked On Sports today. From the games that matter most to the biggest stories in sports. Everything that you need to know that can only come from the expert analysis of the Locked On Network. Check it out, Locked On Sports today, wherever you get podcasts. All right, so Tony, tonight, the Charlotte Hornets, 8-23, beat the Sacramento Kings, 16-13. The Toronto Raptors lost again, this time in overtime, to the Philadelphia 76ers. They're in a complete free fall. The Hawks had to outlast the Orlando Magic, 11-21, who've been playing very well, by just 1 point, 126-125. The San Antonio Spurs, who were like the worst team in the league, and they're the worst by net margin by a significant degree, got another win versus the Houston Rockets. But maybe more notably, the Minnesota Timberwolves. This was their starting five: Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, Naz Reid, Austin Rivers, and D'Angelo Russell. They beat the Dallas Mavericks with Luka and Christian Wood and Dorian Finney-Smith and Reggie Bullock and Spencer Dinwiddie, 116-106, led wire to wire. The Oklahoma City Thunder knock off the 17 and now 14 Blazers, 123-121 behind Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. And this is following night after night after night, where in this league, it is any given day that ends in Y. Like any given night right now, the toughest teams in this league, are all feeling way more vulnerable than I can remember in previous years. The Boston Celtics were the cream of the crop for weeks and weeks in this league. They are 1-4 in their last 5 games, with a 1 win being an overtime win over the Lakers when Anthony Davis missed 2 icing free throws. They just lost to the Magic in back-to-back games. We have so much parity right now. I guess the key question I have for you is this good or bad for the NBA?
I think it's great. It's great for the regular season product because anybody can beat anybody given night right now. It feels like that. There are a lot of chalk games. It's the regular season, but like you just said, a lot. Like the Magic have won 6 in a row before losing at the buzzer today to the Magic. Like the Magic were 5-20 before a 6-game winning streak. What? Like how does that even happen for a team of that level? Like anybody can beat anybody right now, and I think that is a fascinating thing for a fan of any team, and like you can kind of buy any level of hope or direction for your franchise, which is gripping for fans. It makes every game more fun to watch, and it feels like every team's got like the dude or like someone interesting to really latch onto too, which makes it fun, and it's maybe part of why the parity is such an interesting thing. So I think that aspect is good for the league in the regular season, and the other part of it is you could tell me 6 teams win the West, 7, and I'd be like, okay, yeah, I guess. The East is a little more top heavy, but I suppose you could tell me 4 teams win the East, and I'd be like, yeah. Like there are so many ways this season could go that the parity not only affects the, night to night intrigue of the standings and who's good and who's not, but also the discourse around like what teams are really good, what teams are going to be legit in the postseason, because there's so many right now that it's great for the league in terms of interest and great for the fan on a nightly basis.
It's interesting because the NBA has always been such a top-heavy league. People are having kind of a hard time with it because they're used to seeing these great teams. Like, I'm with you. I love that every night it seems like there's a different upset and there's a chance for all these teams to make hay. And if you're wondering, like, isn't this just an early season thing? I actually did the number crunching. And so before game 41, so in the first half of the season, okay, a team that is over 500 a team that is over 500 since 2003 has beaten a team under 500 70% of the time, just straight up, 70% of the time, the better team has won. A team that was over 500 has beaten the under 500 team 70% of the time. Going into tonight's action, that was at 56%.
Wow.
A 14 percentage point differential, which is much, much closer to a coin flip at 50-50 than it is to a 70% chance. So it really has kind of shown itself through this early season that, yeah, the teams that are over 500 can lose to these teams that are under 500. It does show, I think, the depth of the league, right? Because if Shea's not playing for OKC, that's a blowout. But Shea is so singularly amazing. He's able to lift up what I think is a pretty bad Thunder roster, even without Josh Giddey tonight, to make things happen and get it done. Like that Blazers team, I think, is good. You know, the Suns just got done with this really rough stretch. Like the Rockets are once again horrible and just lost to the Spurs. They beat the Suns, what, a week ago? Like, it is wild how it is. The only teams that seem to be really pretty consistent right now are the Milwaukee Bucks, who, again, the numbers say aren't that dominant, and their schedule has been pretty easy. The Cavs have been pretty consistent outside of a small slip. The Nets have been consistent outside of and their 1-5 start. The Celtics were consistent until a week ago. And then you got the Memphis Grizzlies, who I think are, you know, they've been the class of the Western Conference. They're at the top. Unbeatable at home has really been kind of the model for the Grizzlies. But even they lost to the Thunder this weekend. So it really is like you're going to have to bring it. And that, to me, I think is one of the differentials here, though, is the teams that are good can't just go through the motions and get separation. These teams are so good and the shooting variance is so high that teams are able to hang in there. And it makes for, I think, a really compelling product. But it's also got us scratching our heads every night to be like, how did they lose? How did this team win? Why didn't this team win? It's hard, I think, for teams to get, and talking to coaches, I've heard this a little bit, they're having a hard time feeling like their teams are playing consistently. And it'll be interesting to see how that evolves as we head into Christmas and then into this quote unquote serious part of the season, when the season begins at Christmas through the All-Star break.
That's all really interesting about, you know, the over 500 teams beating under 5 teams. And I think, like, just digging through the standings after you say that, I think a lot of teams are like close to 500 in a way that makes that tricky, where it's like the Heat are 16-15. And if they play the 15-16 Pacers, like they've split games, like, and that's just an illustration to say there's so many teams close to 500 because there's a lot of parity this year, right? That's what has those stats kind of play back and forth against each other, where it's like, oh, there's all this parity, but also it's because all these teams have the same record that it seems so crazy. Like all these teams are right around 500 because no one's really that much better than each other, and no one is awful, right? So that means anybody can beat anybody on any given night, which is so fascinating. Like the top team in the West is 19-10. Like that's a 54 win team. Like that's not that high. I think the Bucks and Celtics are clearly going to get to about the 60 mark, but it doesn't seem like there's so many dominant teams this year, and there's fewer truly awful teams. Like even the Spurs were really good to start the season. The Thunder are okay. The Hornets, when LaMelo plays, are good. Like there's truly no awful teams, and that is so fascinating on a night-to-night basis that like you can lose if things happen. And as teams kind of optimize the whole shooting thing, that adds variance to their level of play. You know, these kind of things can happen. And not only that, sometimes there are big blowouts, right? Like that's another fascinating part of it.
A couple teams, just a note here as we go along. The Dallas Mavericks, this is my favorite stat. The Dallas Mavericks, after losing tonight to the Minnesota Timberwolves, are 11-9 versus teams 500 or better, and 4-7 versus teams under 500.
Gosh.
Like, and this, you know, I have to check and see which one this qualified as. Like this roster tonight was definitely a sub 500 roster. Yeah, Wolves are 16-15. So technically right now that doesn't count towards that number based off of the ESPN page I'm using for that number. Like that's what's interesting is like this was they're actually worse than that. They should be 11-8 versus teams over 500 and 4-8 versus teams under 500 based off of the roster that they face tonight. And then they're not the only ones. Like you look at this and the Denver Nuggets are 4-6 versus teams over 500, 14. They have 5 losses already to teams under 500. You're trying to get through the season with around 10. That's like a goal I found that is pretty significant. The Blazers are 500 versus teams over 500. They're 7-4, which is not great versus teams below. Like there's all these teams that look like it. Dallas, though, as we kind of wrap up here, Dallas is the one team I think that is most mystifying. Like think about the wins that Dallas has this season. Phoenix. They come a point from beating Milwaukee. They've beaten the Warriors, right? Like they have all of these signature wins. They've lost to the Pistons without Cade Cunningham, the Magic without Paolo Banchero, the Wizards without Bradley Beal and Kristaps Porzingis, and now the Wolves without Karl Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert.
That this stretch sums up the Mavs season, right? November 9th through November 18th. They lose to the Magic, they lose to the Wizards, then they beat the Blazers and Clippers, then they lose to the Rockets, and then they beat the Nuggets. It's like, what?
What?
that seems exactly backwards from what I would expect in that same stretch at the easiest level. Yeah, and that's how the league is this year. They're like the perfect embodiment of it. That team is weird in a number of ways, but that is perhaps the best way to illustrate it.
All right, let's go wrap it up for Locked On NBA. Thanks for joining us. You can follow Tony on Twitter for, I guess, as long as it's around, at TEastNBA. My thanks to Tony for joining me tonight. David Ramil will be back next week. Want to do note that in honor of David, you should go check out Jalen Green's shooting line tonight. Make sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Leave those 5-star reviews. And check out the YouTube page. You can check out a live version of the show. Tomorrow, you got Jake Madison, John Corrales. Love that show. It's a great combination. Got shows all throughout the week here heading into the holidays. If you're traveling for the holidays, make sure you stay safe. We'll see you guys again next time. Thanks for joining us on Locked On NBA.